Right. So, two pieces of today's discussion. We will be talking a little bit about healthcare transition. So I'll introduce myself. My name's Andy McCormick. I'm a MedPeds trained doc who works at the Down Syndrome Center of Western Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh, and I help run the Healthy Transitions program. I was just looking at this today. Our program has now been running for 9 years. And what we do is we create a bridge. And so Pittsburgh bridges are a big deal. We create a bridge to think about how does an individual with Down syndrome move from childhood to adulthood. And I specifically said childhood to adulthood because we believe that transition isn't just about healthcare, that it needs to be holistic and connect with all parts of their life. Now, I have done this talk in some form in lots of different ways and lots of different lengths, but I will say 15 minutes is probably the most challenging length because there is a lot of information. So I'm going to be giving some big overviews. I have a lot of slides that I'm going to skip, but I'm sure we will be posting these slides somewhere so that if you want more detail, you can go back through my slides to be able to get that. So to start us off, I want to just hit this quick outline of thinking about, we're going to be focusing on why. Why is transition important? We're going to talk about specifically transition pitfalls, and then really, really important, we're going to talk about there's a philosophy behind how transition occurs, and then how do we operationalize that into a functional toolkit? And that's really where I'm going to be taking us today. And when I think about the why, there's a lot of different ways and perspectives you can think about this, but I think one of the most powerful is this idea of inclusion. All of us would probably be on board with the idea that inclusion is really, really important, right? The idea that individuals are not only present, but they're also valued. And I will argue that transition is one of the most vulnerable times in which inclusion can be attacked. The reason why I say that is that when individuals with Down syndrome are moving from childhood to adulthood, there are multiple pitfalls and multiple domains of their life in which things can kind of fall apart. And why we have to value transition is that if we really value inclusion, meaning that we hope that our young people who are becoming adults can be valued in society, then we want their whole self to be there. We don't want these pitfalls to impair who they are being present. So what I mean by that is as we age, the reality is one of us, eventually we're going to hit 21 years of age, right? If you want to call that the cutoff line, and you're going to move into adulthood. You're going to be an adult. But the question is, has something happened that led to your full self not being there? Because our full self is who we are and who we should be valued in our society. So I would point to that inclusion is really the why in which transition is so important to me and why it should be important to all of us. So let's talk a little bit about pitfalls. The first one is obvious, right? I call it the transfer leap. This is by and far, as healthcare professionals, where we struggle the most. As a system, we have not created a good path, a good journey point on which we develop people so that when they're moving to adulthood, they have all the skills that they need. Instead, what we do is we let time pass and then we ask them to leap. We ask them to jump into adulthood, jumping this chasm and hoping they make it. But there are so many different ways they can have pitfalls that this can be a real challenge. And the other thing that often happens is even when we start developing these concepts, we build a bridge, but sometimes that bridge is bare bones, right? It's like this rope bridge that we're trying to walk across, and we're not sure if that slat is going to hold us or if we're going to fall through. So one of the things we're going to be talking about is that one of the gaps we're going to address is how do we build a strong bridge? How do we make sure that we have the right steel that crosses that chasm that is strong? But we also are going to remember that a bridge is not just the steel that crosses the chasm, that there's an on-ramp, a preparation phase, and an off-ramp. And we'll get back to that in a few minutes. And this is the kind of the core steps we're going to be talking about philosophically about how we build that bridge. So we'll come back to this in a minute. The second gap that I really think about is this idea that transition is often done in silos. What I mean by that is, hey, the school is responsible for the education to employment transition. Let's them handle that. Hey, we're in charge of the healthcare transition. We're going to focus on that, and that's where we're going to put our energy. Hey, there are financial and there are legal transitions. Maybe there's a lawyer, maybe there's a financial planner. We're going to let them deal with that. And the problem is there's not cross communication. And so what can happen is if some of these silos are done really well, that's okay. But if they're not all done well, we can see some breakdown in the system. And what I mean by that is I often think of transition as a puzzle. All of us have done tons of puzzles, specifically in the time of COVID, right? And we have a 1,000-piece puzzle. And the worst thing you can have at the end is if you finish a puzzle, but one piece is missing, because that piece makes you see that the whole thing is not complete. And this is the same thing with transition. Each domain of transition, be it health, employment, legal, community, financial, they all are so key and so integrated that they touch each other, impact each other. So what I always talk about with families is, if I don't have a discussion with you in clinic about what's happening in school and what your IEP looks like and how they're planning for your future, for movement from, to post-secondary or to employment, what we know is that in the intellectual disability community, that 80% of people will graduate to unemployment. And we have to do something about that, because if you're graduating to unemployment, that means you're at home, you're on a couch, you've lost your social structure, you have an impact on your mood. We can see how that directly impacts their healthcare. So if we think about a silo, we are going to actually miss what we're doing. We have to think about a pieces of the puzzle that transition needs to be longitudinal, meaning we build a bridge that is an on-ramp and off-ramp, and it also needs to be holistic, thinking about all these domains and how they interact. The final thing that I'm going to really focus on, if I would say the third pitfall, is what I call the transition tug of war. That means there are multiple stakeholders here, right? There's the young adult, there's the parents, there's the healthcare providers who may be pediatrics and adult, and they all have these different ideas of what good transition looks like. And some of those actually pull against each other, right? Because the kid wants independence, and the parent wants the kid to be safe. The adult provider wants the kid to start making decisions, and the pediatric provider is used to kind of making sure that everybody is comfortable and safe. And so we see this tug of war of what it looks like for them to move into the adult world. But I would argue that this is true, and we have to rethink our system. And this is a slide that I was adapted from the Good to Go group from Toronto, and one of our providers at Pittsburgh, Bev Kozmak, which really is this idea that there needs to be this developmental approach that as a child ages, the roles at which each of these different stakeholders takes changes. And I really think of this like a dance, right? So I have 3 girls. My oldest is 16 and my youngest is 10. But I can remember when they were all really young, classic thing in the family, we would turn on some music and we'd have a dance party, and we'd all be dancing, and everybody would look at Dad and they thought I had some really good dance moves. But as they've gotten older, right, my 16-year-old, right, doesn't think my dance moves are as awesome as before, because she's matured in what that looks like. And so maybe in the beginning, I was showing her how to dance. What are the kind of moves that you should have? How do you listen to the music? And now she's like, Dad, you are uncoordinated and you can't keep a beat, because she's learning that independence of how she does it her own. So in the same way, as our kids age, we have different roles. So early on, the parent is the caretaker. They're doing everything. But by the end, they should really just be the consultant, right? They should be the person the young adult can turn to for the questions and support they need, but pushing in for the young adult to make decisions. And I know this is variable for each of our kids and where their ability level is, but this is the general pathway should be taking. So transition should be longitudinal. Transition should be holistic, and it really should be developmentally progressive towards independence. And we really have to think of that as our model as we're doing transition. So I know we have just about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to hit some high-level things. So the first thing we're going to talk about is that transition philosophically is this longitudinal developmental approach, and it moves through these steps of discovery, tracking, preparing, planning, transferring, and then transferring. And these are steps that progress as we're building skills. So discovery is all about that. We have to have, it's a journey. Discovery is about dreaming for where we're going to be in the future. What does a healthy transition, what does healthy adulthood look like? What are those goals we should have for our young adult? So that as we start planning our map there, we know where we're going. Tracking is the phase that we actually have to say there are steps along this process, and we have to make sure they happen. So, we think about, like, have you discussed medical decision-making? Have you developed a portable medical summary? Have you checked for readiness and goal development? So there are physical steps that need to happen along this path, and we have to be able to track it. Preparing and planning is this developmental approach, right? Not only do we have to do things, but we have to augment it to the individual. So we have to assess the young adult and say, what skills do they have? And then how do we build on those skills that are individualized to them to develop independence? And only when we've done all that work can we think of transferring, right? That when they're ready and they have those right skills, are we able to make sure they can move over to the adult world? And what are the things they need to be successful in that transition? And then completing is the idea that there's an off-ramp, right? There's a way of checking back. So if there are gaps, we can fill in those gaps and support. So what I want to do is quickly show each of these different steps. What is a key tool that you as a provider can use to support in that process? And these are going to be kind of our key tools: educational transition visits, our checklist, our readiness assessment, transfer gear, and graduation packet. So let's look at discovery. What does this really look like? So first of all, we need our families to have access to resources. And there are a lot of different resources that get there. Almost every state has a national transition conference, and there's great transition resources that are available online, like Got Transitions, and also thinking about access to literature. So we used to have the Down Syndrome Transition Workbook, which has gone out of publication right now, but there's another resource, Transition Planning Services, which is a complete guide that people can access. But besides that, what can you actually do as a provider to make sure we're in the discovery phase? So the first point of that is, how do you build your team? So when I think about transition in that first visit, it's not about me as a provider telling you what to do. It's us as a team, right? Me as a provider, you as a young adult, and the parents thinking about how can we get together and think about what transition looks like in a healthy way. And it's not a single visit, it's a progressive process. So the very first thing that I think is important when we develop a transition program is a very boring thing, which is a transition policy statement. This is a statement that I use as a contract with families saying, hey, transition is a vulnerable time. For that reason, we are going to be meeting on an annual basis or every other year. And we're going to do a couple things. I'm going to make sure you're doing all the homework you need to get to where you're going. We're going to make sure we're checking for the skills. We're going to check for readiness and think about how we can build those skills. And then together, we're going to define when transition should occur, somewhere between 18 and 21 years of age. And together, we're going to be assessing on a yearly basis that we're going to get there. So the transition policy statement really is this idea that we as an institution think that transition is important, and then us as a team are going to develop a contract with each other of how we're going to make transition happen. So that's the discovery phase. The second one is the tracking phase, and this is that checklist I said. We have to make sure that what we're saying we're doing is happening. So this is an example of our checklist that I go with families. So I literally have to write a date on the calendar of when did we discuss the transition policy statement? Hey, have we done readiness assessments? Have we assessed the skill of the young adult and develop goals around it? So it's not just assessments, but also goal development. And that doesn't occur on one session, but it calls on multiple times. So we're going to track that we did it multiple times. Have we done a portable medical summary? We're going to talk about that in this minute. This is a document that summarizes their care in a single page or two. And the idea is this is a way that you can give that institutional information. That young adult has been in children's or in a pediatric center or with a single provider for their whole life. And all that information needs to be transferred on. How do we do that effectively? And then we have things that are kind of medical adjacent. So have we talked about decision-making? Have we decided when our transfer date is going to be? And do we have a list of providers that this individual needs to transfer to? There was a study that looked at what is the number one complaint of families with pediatric providers. And the answer is, when we talked about movement to the adult world, the pediatric providers did not provide who the landing point was. So they didn't help them find who the subspecialist was. And that's what families want to do. So part of our checklist is making sure we're having that conversation. Hey, you need a new endocrinologist. Who is that going to be? Maybe I don't know the answer, but we can work on it together. So that's part of the process. Next is that preparing and planning phase. Not only do we have to do these specific steps, but we have to assess readiness and then develop goals. And this is a really important one. And so the tool that I use in our clinic is called the TRAQ, or TRAQ, Transition Readiness Assessment Questionnaire. There's a couple validated tools, and you can find them on Got Transitions. This is the one we do. It's been validated for individuals with intellectual disabilities, and that's why we choose it. And it looks at different domains for healthcare independence, right? So it looks at med management, appointment management, tracking your health, talking with providers, managing your daily activities. And the idea is you, with the family and the young adult, find out where are the areas of need, right? And it's on this Likert scale of saying, I'm not doing this and I'm not interested, all the way up to I do this every time on my own. And you identify what are the key skills where there might be gaps. And so this is an example of one that was filled out, and you might identify one part of that, like taking your medication independently. And what you do then is then you have to develop a goal. You're saying, well, I'm going to learn to take my medication independently. But what you have to do with that goal is you have to really, really boil down and then operationalize it, right? You have to be able to say, well, how do you give the medication now? And so what I'll often say is, well, do you have a pill tray? Are you guys filling the pill tray together? Can your young adult fill the pill tray with you and then eventually build on that skill to learn for independence? So it's about assessing where they're at and then helping building resources for them. And I'm just going to do a quick resource too. We created this with Carnegie Mellon University, which is a local Pittsburgh institution, where we created this Teen's Guide to Medical Transition that mirrors the track. So it's a workbook that, like, once you develop a skill, like I'm going to take my medication independently, you can then use certain pages to talk about resources. So I always show this page that ties taking my medication. So these are questions that the parent and the young adult can discuss when they're filling the pill tray. Like, hey, what's the name of your medication? Why do you take that medication? What happens if something goes wrong when you take that medication? What do you do if you miss the medication? And so it's a way of kind of developing some dialogue. Not only are we building a skill, but we're hopefully building some health literacy and some strength behind that. So then the final thing we're going to be moving into is this idea of transfer, right? And what I really think about is transfer gear. This is kind of the functional tools you need to take with you as you move into the adult world. And the most significant of these is our portable medical summary. And the idea behind this is it gives a glimpse to an adult provider who might be meeting this young adult for the first time to know key information. So they don't have to go through 2,000 pages of documents that include vital signs and meds and all labs and everything. They can be boiled down to a concise problem list, what the current treatment regimen is, what their meds, any kind of medical equipment. And also at the bottom, we can see something is a list of providers. So who they can come talk back to if they have questions. And then we also include some other things that are really important. Have we talked about power of attorney and guardianship? Do we have that paperwork? Is there a living will? A resume? Because we think about that education to employment transition, you need a resume to be really doing well. Any financial documents. So we help families build those things. And of course, the last thing I think about is the off-ramp, right? It's the completing phase, and that's the graduation packet. So moving to the adult world should be just like graduating high school. It should be celebrated, but we want to make sure that we've done some really important things to make that successful. And I'd say number one of this would be the warm handoff, that when we move to the adult world, we need to have some direct communication with our adult providers to make sure that we have that happen. And that can happen in different ways: joint visits, phone calls, and sometimes it's just a personal letter that can kind of make sure that they have that connection point. So I'm going to end now because this is a real brief talk, but I always like to highlight on the end of my talk thinking about that transition to the journey. And these are the steps that we help our young adults get there, how we build that bridge on the journey. But I like to highlight this quote from Fred Rogers, since I'm from Pittsburgh. And he said that transitions are almost always signs of growth, but they can bring feelings of loss. To get somewhere new, we often have to leave somewhere behind. And I like to share this specifically with our parents, because transition from their perspective is that there's, in a sense, a letting go. And that's a growth thing for the young adult, but there can be a loss. And it's just a reality and a truth about what we're doing. So I'm going to end there. I think I went just a little bit over, but happy to answer any quick questions about that talk. And then we can move on to the next section.
Andy, that was great. Thank you very much. Anybody have questions or comments for Andy? That was so much wonderful information. I'm got some people in the office I'm going to encourage to look at your presentation when it's posted. So anyone have questions?
Actually,
yeah. Go ahead.
Ellen?
I was just wondering, one of the issues that we have is just finding adult primary care providers. I have a couple at UVA that always take these patients who are local, but I was wondering how you find a pool of adult providers that know how to take care of individuals with Down syndrome.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different ways I think about this. Number one way, I will highlight Brian and of course my local favorite adult Down syndrome doc, Peter, and think about the work they've done around the adult guidelines, right? So the idea behind those guidelines is that the truth is that adult providers are really good at taking care of people with complex medical needs. So an individual with Down syndrome is not going to be more complicated than the individual who has congestive heart disease, diabetes, atrial fibrillation, has had a stroke. Like, they can take care of complexity. The area that makes them uncomfortable is saying that they don't take care of a lot of individuals with Down syndrome. So what they need is the resources to think about how they can do that well. So I really applaud the work from Brian and Peter and the whole adult working group, thinking about how can we offer that resource to adult providers so that they can use those skills of taking care of individuals who have complicated healthcare needs in a way that gives them some comfort. And so my usual advice to a family is, number one, if you have a parent who has an adult provider that they have a relationship, that they have comfortability with, then that's a natural connecting point. And so have a conversation because they already have a relationship. And so a lot of times, and we found this, that they feel very comfortable with additional resources, knowing that they can kind of support that young adult in that center. Now, if that isn't the case, we have obviously over time had connections within the Down Syndrome Association in Pittsburgh, where we just kind of collect who are the adult providers who have that comfortability and make those connections. And then, of course, one of the other resources would be if you have your local adult Down syndrome center, saying who do they connect with. And we obviously have the privilege of having a great center as a resource and backup, and that can be a challenge in places where that's not a possible option. But that's usually what I would say is really kind of encouraging to say that it's not about complexity, it's about comfort of knowing what information they need to do, and that using the adult guidelines is a great resource to support that. And I saw that Carrie had a question about where do we find some of these tools? I will say the best place to find these tools is if you go to gottransitions.org. That is the best. So Got Transitions, is, if you guys know, is an NIH-funded group that really does a lot of work about transition, and they do a lot of work about putting resources out there. And in fact, there's tabs for providers as well as families, as well as researchers, to think about what are the helpful tools for each of those individuals to allow them for advocacy. So that's, you can find all of these resources there. The only one you won't would be the transition team guidebook, because we created that internally. And I'm happy to share the PDF of that if people were interested.